Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 6. Chapter 6 deals with listening, feedback, and critical thinking. The ability to be an effective listener is extremely important in terms of good communication and effective relationships. So exploring this chapter will be really useful for us because we can look at the different stages of listening and the processes that take place, and we can look at our own listening skills and see if there are any areas where we might be able to improve. So let's get started. During this chapter, we will define listening and explain its role in communication. We will also distinguish among 4 different types of listening. This includes appreciative, comprehensive, critical, and empathic listening. We will also explain the 6 stages of listening, and we will describe the factors that contribute to ineffective listening. In addition, we will summarize the different kinds of feedback that listeners can provide. We will also discuss critical thinking and its impact on listening. And finally, we will go over several guidelines that will help us to demonstrate and learn effective listening. So let's get started. One of the first things that we want to do in this chapter is we want to look at the process of hearing, which is a physical or physiological process where we are taking in sounds, right? The sound of people's voices, any kind of background sounds, perhaps any kind of, other technology sounds that are coming in, the TV, the buzzing of the refrigerator, a telephone, whatever, right? And listening, which is a deliberate psychological process where we seek to understand and retain information. Now, a lot of times people just think, well, I'm listening to you, so it's fine. But it's very good for us to learn to distinguish between the physical process of hearing and the psychological process of actually listening. So when we decide that we are going to participate and actively listen, then what that means is that we want to set aside any kind of mental or emotional things that are distracting us or that could distract us. We obviously want to reduce any kinds of other technology distractions. So we want to put our cell phone down and perhaps on silent. We want to turn the TV down or off. We want to make sure that the music or background sounds that we have are low enough so that we can actually participate in this active process. So it's very important for all of us to really start to distinguish between the physical process of hearing and the psychological process of listening. And this is something that people may take for granted sometimes, but I think that once we get through this chapter, it's going to make a lot more sense to you how we can choose to be mindful and present in our listening interactions, and also we can choose to respond in a kind, effective, and responsible manner based on learning several principles that we're going to just discuss here. So the reality is that in order to be an effective listener, it does take effort. And this is why at the beginning of the lecture, we distinguished between the physical process of hearing and the deliberate psychological decision that we make when we are going to listen. So listening takes effort, and the reason for this is that if we're going to be a good listener, we really need to be mindful of learning how to empty our minds, or at least shelf certain things, okay? Put things on a shelf in the back of our minds so that we can be present to the people that we're with. So what this shows us is that the process of effectively listening doesn't just take place instantly. We actually have to make a decision to, number one, be mindful of the fact that we're bringing in our own distractions to this conversation, whether it's a hard day at work or whether it's, certain challenges we're facing at school, right? We need to be conscious that we're bringing these concerns in, and we need to be mindful that we want to try to put these things on the shelf or empty our minds so that we can really be present with people. All of us have been in a situation before where people are not really listening to us, right? You're trying to tell, your dad about this exciting experience you had where you ran into some old friends from, your previous job or something. And instead of really looking at you and paying attention and nodding and giving you eye contact and being a mindful listener, maybe they are, rustling papers or looking around at other things or checking their cell phone, right? So these are things that really convey to people that we're not listening. And I would add that when we don't listen effectively or mindfully to people, we're sending a much larger message, not just that we're not paying attention, but that the message that they're giving us doesn't matter to us. So it's really a great skill at this point in our life, earlier in life, to learn how to be an effective listener so that we can really give people the attention that they deserve. So again, mindfulness allows us to empty our mind of personal concerns, interfering emotions, and we deliberately choose to focus on the person that we're talking with in the here and in the now. And what you're going to find when you start to try to actively decide to be an effective listener is that you're going to notice that there will be all sorts of distractions that will try to pull you away from being present. And so this is why developing the skill of mindfulness is such a great skill to learn, because I might be talking with my husband, for example, and he's trying to tell me about a project at work. And, I'm really trying to be a present listener and to, give him all of my attention. And perhaps, some of the technology or techno terms that he's using are kind of ambiguous to me because maybe we work in different industries, right? So something like that can be distracting and it can cause you to start to lose interest or not be present. So in that situation, I can be conscious of the fact that I don't know all the specifics about that particular project or the technical details he's talking about. But what I can do in that moment that I become conscious that I'm starting to glaze over or not be as present is I can step up to the plate and I can say, oh, well, tell me about this product that you folks are developing and how is this different from the last project that you were working on, right? So asking questions is a great way to stay mindful, to stay present. You can also look at the nonverbal cues that people are using in addition to what they're saying. And it's always just a great idea to try to listen, not just with your ears, but also with your eyes, right? And we talked a lot about nonverbal communication in a previous chapter. So at the onset of looking at listening, just the process of being able to distinguish between physical and psychological, very important, and taking the awareness in that in order to truly be an effective listener, we need to learn the skill of mindfulness, which will allow us to do that. So let's look at some different types of listening processes that we might find ourselves in. And it's good to look at this because, depending on the kind of listening process we're engaging in, we might be able to use different strategies in order to be effective. So for example, appreciative listening would include listening for enjoyment or relaxation. So we could think about going to a concert where you really love the music, or going to a theater show where you're going to get to watch and listen to all of these really wonderful stories play out. And appreciative listening can also just be listening to people that you are talking with, your family, your friends. You're all just maybe sitting around enjoying spending a nice dinner conversation together, right? And you're just appreciating being there with your family. But we can also look at listening from a more comprehensive standpoint. So what this means is that we are listening in order to gain knowledge that we need to acquire. So many of you right now in this lecture are listening to this lecture from a comprehensive standpoint because you know that there is information that you're hoping to learn. And in listening to these lectures, you are gaining a more in-depth understanding and description of many of these topics, right? So we can distinguish between appreciative listening and comprehensive listening. Obviously, comprehensive listening is more demanding in terms of the cognitive load, in terms of staying focused on the topic, really seeking to identify and understand what's being said. And of course, retaining information is another thing that we would want to think about with comprehensive listening as well. On the other hand, we might find ourselves in situations where we are engaging in critical listening. Critical listening is something that takes place when we are listening in order to evaluate the worth of a message. So I would think about, your interactions, let's say when you are watching the political debates on TV, or perhaps you're looking at buying a new automobile and you want to look at all of the different types of details that go along with each vehicle. You're also looking at, well, should I get a new one or should I get one that's a few years old? These are all different kinds of situations where you might be a critical listener. And finally, we might find ourselves in situations where we are engaging in empathic listening. Empathic listening takes place when we are primarily listening so that we can help other people. So let's say you have a child and your child comes to you and is upset about something, and you're trying to figure out, what is it that upset your little, kid there so much. And so you're going to, obviously try to be very empathic. You're going to get down on your knees or try to be at least on the same eye level with the kids so that you can accommodate that they're, smaller in size. And you're going to ask them questions to try to figure out what's wrong and what you can do to help. We might also think of empathic listening when we're talking with our friends or perhaps family members. And, you might not know what's going on with somebody, but you might know them well enough where when they come home from work, you can tell if they've had a good day or perhaps a challenging day. And so, you might be asking them, well, so how did things go today at work? And in that situation, you're not really, seeking to listen to them from a critical standpoint, right? You're basically just trying to help them feel better. And so in that sense, you're asking questions about what happened, how they felt about it. You're probably also looking at their nonverbals and listening with your eyes in addition to your ears. And you're really listening to try to help them process through whatever they need to process so that they can move on and enjoy the evening with you. And so each of these different kinds of listening modes or types, for example, will shape the way that we are cognitively perceiving things and what we might say in response to what people are saying to us. Figure 6.3 in your book allows us to look at the different stages of listening. As you can see, the first stage deals with the physical process of hearing. This deals with the actual words that are being said, what people are talking about, right? What kinds of examples they're using, and things like that. Now, there are many challenges that can impede our ability to effectively hear. You could think about different background sounds that might affect your ability to really listen to someone on the phone or in person. You might also think about things such as physical abilities or challenges. So people who are struggling with hearing may have a more challenging time understanding what's being said, which of course can lead to all sorts of complications with good communication. So this is one of the reasons why it's so important for us to be mindful about staying present and also creating an environment that is conducive for effective listening. So what we can do is we can work to declutter our environment, if you will, from distractions that would keep us from hearing someone effectively, such as putting our cell phones down and turning them off, or turning the TV off, or turning music down, or other types of distractions that can impede the hearing process. Moving on to the understanding stage. During this stage, which is considered to be stage 2, we basically relate to what we have listened to and what we already know. So we're not really at the point where we are judging, but we're trying to integrate the information that another person is sharing with us based on the information that we have had in our life up until that moment. Now, at this stage, the understanding stage, it's extremely important for us to be aware of the fact that we want to avoid what are called red flag words. So if you think back to a previous lecture, we talked about the importance of language and the importance of using words that are anti-inflammatory or that are not negative in terms of their connotations. We had a whole discussion about the denotative and the connotative meaning of words. And one of the things that we always want to be conscious of is that we want to use language that will not alienate or upset people unnecessarily, right? So what this means is that we want to make sure that we use words that are descriptive and in many ways neutral whenever possible, and focusing on facts and evidence and things like that, rather than using labels or different types of language that could be considered offensive, upsetting, or inflammatory. This is the case with your one-to-one communication in dyads. This is also the case in group communication. And of course, in professional or public communication, we especially do not want to use language that is inflammatory. The reason for this is that once a person hears a word or an idea that they find to be personally upsetting, inflammatory, or aggravating, then what happens in terms of them listening to us is that we can totally lose people, right? Because there's a whole host of assumptions that people can make about you depending on the words that you use, right? So we always want to try to use words that are descriptive and neutral instead of loaded and inflammatory. And this is why it's important to be mindful of what we're saying when we're saying it. And this is also another reason why it's important for us to do our perception checking so that we can make sure that we go into our communications with people treating them fairly and not judging them. Let's move on to the next stage, which is the remembering stage. This is the stage where we basically decide what we're going to try to hold on to or retain and what we can let go, because obviously our brain does not have enough room to retain every single piece of information that we may ever come across. And so we can distinguish between things like our short-term memory and our long-term memory, right? Our short-term memory is basically all of the things that we remember in the next, I don't know, couple of hours perhaps, or maybe within the same day after hearing it. What's interesting about memory is that according to your textbook, only 50% of a message is actually remembered immediately after listening to it, and only 25% after a period of time has passed. So what this means is we want to be conscious and mindful about remembering details that are important to us, even if it means that we are writing things down or taking notes. This is one of the reasons why students take notes in class lecture, right? Because you want to be able to remember the key points that someone has said and you don't want to lose it. This is also the reason why in public speaking, we start out our public speech by telling people what we're going to tell them. And then during the speech, we tell them what we're telling them. And then at the end of the speech, we tell them what we told them. And the reason for this is because repetition is something that will assist in having people walk away retaining more information. So let's move on to the interpreting stage. This is where people make sense of a message. They may try to integrate it into their schema or what they currently know about the issue. In the interpreting stage, we can look at the idea of using what they call dual perspective taking. Dual perspective taking is a very valuable process for us because it allows us to consider the perspective of the other person when they are sharing information with us. Now, when we are understanding and remembering, we are listening to the information from our own perspective, right? However, in the interpreting stage, we can allow ourselves to consider or to empathize or to try to imagine what the other person is experiencing, thinking, and feeling. Now, we have to be very careful about making interpretations that perhaps are not correct. So we definitely do not want to impose personal meaning onto another person's message. We're going to talk about several different types of negative listening strategies that people may use in the interpreting and responding stage later on in this lecture. But for now, we can just know that interpreting is an extremely important process in the stages of listening, and that generally speaking, we should always strive to consider another person's perspective before we evaluate and respond. During the evaluation stage, we basically decide whether a message is correct, and then we might also critically analyze the message, okay? So during this stage, the evaluation stage, we may attempt to distinguish facts, so things that are actually true, from inferences. Inferences are things that we draw conclusions about, right? And we might look at the evidence that someone has presented, And we might also evaluate any kinds of faulty arguments or prejudices that we hear coming through in the message. So it's really important at this stage as well to stay mindful about how we're evaluating people's messages. This is also another stage in the evaluation stage where we can consider other people's perspectives, right? And then in doing this, we are able to respond in the most optimum way. So during the last stage, which is the responding stage, we basically react to what we have heard, and we may offer feedback to let the person or the speaker know what our thoughts and our feelings are about what we've heard. So all of these stages are extremely important. And obviously, once the stages of listening happen, then a person would respond, and then they would communicate something to the other person, and then the process goes on until that conversation has ended, right? So we can look at these stages of listening, and we can really start to think about what stages we are particularly good at, and perhaps what stages we could work on in terms of improving our competence. There are several types of problematic behaviors that we want to be aware of so that we can avoid doing this when we are listening. One of these behaviors deals with fraudulent listening. Fraudulent listening basically includes the people who are faking it, right? So they're trying to make you think that they're listening, but they're not really paying attention. They might do things like nod their head or say things like, uh-huh, so that they're making you think that they're paying attention, but they're really thinking about something else or someone else. Fraudulent listening is an especially interesting process because the research shows that fraudulent listening actually takes more cognitive energy than real effective listening. So that's something to think about the next time you find yourself sort of tuning out and putting on a show. Monopolistic listeners is another group of problematic listening behavior. These are the people that really just want you to listen to them. They don't really want to hear you or engage in a very deep, meaningful way because they really want you to just focus on listening to them. And so monopolistic listeners tend to be fairly egocentric. Sometimes this can be something that we go through maybe just in a period of our life and then we outgrow it. Other times this might just be a character trait that people have. It's interesting to think about the fact that monopolistic listeners really tend to just be kind of focused on their own needs, what they want. And these are the people that we know that will take something that you said about your day and turn it around so that they can talk about their day, right? So we all know people like this. Maybe we've done this ourselves. It's very good to be mindful so that we can work to be present and care about what other people have to say rather than being a monopolistic listener. We may also deal with completers, and this is a strategy whereby people may fill in the blanks for you in the conversation. So you can think of completing as that person who you know who's always finishing your sentences for you, or perhaps they are always substituting a word or providing a word for you when you're searching for the right way to describe something. But people can also do completing when they make inferences or conclusions about a situation which may not be accurate. Selective listeners are the people who tend to hear only what they want to hear, so or that it's important to them or that they have an interest in. So you might be talking about, this great job that you have and how much you really enjoy the actual job itself, and perhaps your coworker or your colleague is not as great to work with, and so you're struggling with working with someone who is difficult to be around. And so instead of addressing the actual problem that you're sharing, which is about a coworker, your selective listener would respond by saying something like, oh yeah, isn't it great to have a good job that you love, and oh, it's such a blessing, and I had a good job that I loved, and this is where I got it and what I did, and oh, that job was so great. It's almost like you didn't even share the other piece of information when you're talking to a selective listener. The avoiders are the people who basically pretend to not hear you, or they forget what you said, or they just act as if you never said anything. So these are the people, for example, that let's say you're on the phone with a friend of yours and it's a little bit late at night, and so you're, thinking it's time to get to bed for work in the morning. So you might say to your friend something like, "Oh, it's been great talking, and I'm so glad we got to catch up tonight, but I really need to get to sleep. It's getting very late. I'm going to be very tired tomorrow." And they might just say something like, "Yeah, so anyway, when I went to the store the other day, I saw so and so. You know so and so, right?" And so they might just, it's like, "Yeah, anyway," and they just keep talking as if you never said that you have to get off the phone. So obviously, this is not an ideal way to listen to people. We do not want to be engaging in any of these behaviors. We can also look at the last type of problematic listening strategy, which are defensive listeners. Defensive listeners tend to interpret the remarks of other people in a way where they feel like they're being attacked or like they have to defend themselves. So these are the people, for example, if another person asks a simple question like, "Where did you go last night in the evening?" Right? Let's say somebody's asking their partner, "Where were you last night? I called and you weren't home," or something. And the listener, instead of describing where they went and what they were doing, they might jump on the other person and say something like, "You're always asking me where I'm at. Why can't you give me some freedom?" Right? So defensive listeners tend to perceive threats in a situation when there's no actual threat that exists. Defensive listening is clearly not an ideal strategy. However, we may find ourselves dealing with that if we're having conflicts with people that are not going well. So when we do see ourselves or other people engaging in this kind of listening, it's probably good to take a step back and try to reassess the situation to see what you could do more effectively. And finally, we can think about attackers. These are people who basically wait for you to make a mistake in what you're saying so they can undercut or challenge what you have to say. So basically, they might sit around and just wait for, figurative ammunition, right? So that they can then come back to you and say something like, "Well, you said this, but that's not correct," or "Where did you get your information about that?" or "What kind of source do you have for making that claim?" Right? So these are the people, rather than working to understand what you're actually trying to say and discussing things with you, they try to compete with you in an effort to outdo you or undercut you. Obviously, communicating with people like this is very challenging because it's extremely invalidating and irritating when you're trying to have a conversation or a relationship with someone who is constantly making you wrong or undercutting or invalidating what you're saying. I would say that if you're dealing with communication with people who are attackers, that you may want to take a step back from the situation. You might also want to show them the different types of listening challenges that exist in our textbook so that they can get a better understanding of the kinds of things that would be more effective. And I think that in our own communication, a lot of us probably have done some of these behaviors in the past. And I think that's what's so liberating about education is that we can integrate new information and new knowledge, and we can work to be better communicators and have better relationships. So let's look at the role of critical thinking in effective listening. Now, I've talked about the idea of media literacy before, and media literacy is the ability to engage in critical thinking and critical analysis about the different types of media, images, messages, and realities that are projected towards us as consumers, right? So we can also think of critical thinking as something that we can do on a day-to-day basis, and you might do it in your class. You might do it when you're listening to people that might be trying to convince you to go and do something. You're definitely going to be engaging in critical thinking when you are looking at opportunities that are going to affect the quality of your life. So things like accepting a job, working on getting a certain type of a degree. Will this degree help you do what you want to do, right? Things like that. So critical thinkers tend to focus on unstated assumptions that maybe people have not explicitly identified, but that are woven into the actual message, okay? They may also identify the strengths and the weaknesses of a speaker's viewpoint, right? This is always a good thing to do. They might also be able to identify different distortions or a suggestion of bias, right? And when I talked in a previous lecture and a previous slide in this lecture about the words we use, this is one of the reasons why we want to make sure that we use descriptive language that is non-biased, because we are able to really be much more effective in reaching people when we use words that do not cause people to have a strong emotional or mental response. Also, critical thinkers would consider the implications of the message and also the implications of what it means if they accept that message as true. So I think that it's always a good idea to consider all of the information. When we talk about critical thinking, it doesn't mean that we are going to be critical of the people that are speaking to us. What it means is that we are going to be careful and deliberate as we evaluate the message. Now, sometimes the distortions or the bias that we're evaluating might be our own distortion or our own biases that are shaping the way that we perceive a message, right? So in general, it's a good idea to always think carefully about the messages that people give you and ask yourself, does this message ring true for me? And if it doesn't ring true for you, then you can look at why that is and perhaps what message is true for you, so that you just don't get swept up in believing things that perhaps are not true for you, or doing things perhaps that are not right for you. Gender and listening style is also something that we want to be aware of. Please take this slide with a grain of salt, because we are making generalizations about women and men, and although the research does show that men and women do tend to communicate in various ways that sometimes differ from each other, we don't ever want to just assume that somebody is going to communicate a certain way or that they should be communicating a certain way because of their gender. So there are always exceptions to the rule, and I think it's important to be aware of that before we discuss the differences that have been found in the research based on female and male communication. So in general, women tend to search for relationships among message parts, right? So somebody might be talking about their job, and then they might be talking about their home life, and then they might be talking about, dealing with taking care of their parents. And these are all different parts of a conversation. And a woman, who was searching for relationships among the message parts would be able to synthesize the fact that, oh, it sounds to me like you're feeling really overwhelmed and challenged with work-life balance issues, right? Because all of those different topics deal with the issue of work-life balance. And a lot of women nowadays who are working and taking care of families and all of this do have struggles with this, right? So that would be an example of searching for relationships among the message parts. Women also, in general, tend to rely more on their feelings and intuition. Women also tend to talk about their feelings more than men. I think that this is probably not very surprising to most of us, right? My husband and I, we always, like to joke that, oh yes, we're talking about feelings, nothing more than feelings, and this was like some song that was from, I don't know, the 40s or 50s. And, we joke about it because I tend to have a very developed emotional experience, right? I tend to be good at identifying my feelings. I express them when I'm feeling it. I'm not someone who stuffs my feelings. I have looked a lot at these issues, being a professor for so many years in these, this area. It doesn't make me perfect at dealing with feelings, right? But my husband is a computer technical engineer kind of person. He doesn't really like to think about feelings very much. He really certainly doesn't want to talk about feelings very much. And so, I think that most of us can agree that women tend to focus more on feelings. They talk more about their feelings. And, this is just something that I have noticed. And of course, there are always exceptions. You might sometimes meet a guy who is extremely based on their feelings, right? Maybe they talk about feelings. Maybe they have a softer side. It's worth considering how, people who go against the norm are perceived, right? So if you know a guy who is a crier, for example, right, how does that influence your perception of him in terms of who he is as a man, in terms of issues related to strength? I think in general there is more of a social acceptance for women to express the soft feelings such as like fear, sadness, love, things like that. We live in a society still that tends to place a lot of stereotypes and expectations on men, that men should be strong and they shouldn't be afraid and they shouldn't certainly be sad, right? So I think that these kinds of expectations can get us into trouble. And I think that, it's really always good for people to learn how to identify, manage, and express their emotions effectively, whether we are male or female. Women also tend to listen in order to enhance their understanding of a person and to bond or connect personal relationships, right? And women do that through talking, through conversations, right? And so this is something that's really interesting. You can ask yourself whether you feel like these ideas are true for you or not. And if they're not true, you can identify where the variations are. And I certainly think that if you are a female that does not tend to rely on your feelings, that is absolutely okay. You do not have to feel like there is anything wrong with you because, you do not perceive things in that way. So I think that wherever we're at in terms of feelings and personal relationships and things like that, it's okay to be you. And it's also okay to work to learn strategies to get closer to other people that we care about. Men, on the other hand, tend to be more likely to be comfortable with comprehensive listening. Okay, so just generally hearing about various topics, right? Just talking about this topic, that topic, this topic. It's fine. They're not probably searching for the relationships among the message parts in the same way, which of course that can shape the way that men might respond to a conversation that they might have with their wife or their partner, right? So men also tend to listen to solve problems. This is something that I have experienced in my life, right? Sometimes when women go to the men in their life who they care about, and the women just want someone to listen to them, right? They just want to talk about the rough day they had. They just want someone to hear them and to validate them. And instead of validating and listening and just being there, men might step up to the plate and say, okay, well, I'm going to go down to that job of yours and I'm going to talk to that coworker and set them straight or whatever, right? Or I'm going to, let's go do this to fix the problem, right? And maybe, the woman who is doing the speaking doesn't want someone to fix her problem for her. She just wants someone to listen and to validate and to tell her that everything is going to be okay, right? So you can understand how these tendencies can create communication complications and they can detract from our ability to really hear each other and respond effectively because of these tendencies we have. In addition, men tend to be more likely to dominate the conversations in terms of the amount of time that they are speaking, how long they speak, how often they speak. And it might also be very interesting for you to think about the fact that according to Alfie Kohn, men are more likely than women to interrupt in conversations. So Cohn's research found that men interrupt women's statements much more frequently than women interrupt men's statements. And in fact, his research actually found that 96% of the interruptions that took place in male to female dyads basically just means two people, he found that 96% of those interruptions were initiated by a man. So I think that this is extremely important for us to consider in terms of the way that we communicate. Obviously, there are women that are going to be interrupting other people as well. In general, the interruption strategy is not ideal or optimum for good communication. And so if we do find that we are someone who does a lot of interrupting, I would advise that we get more conscious of when it's happening and perhaps why we might interrupt people. In general, when we interrupt people, we cut them off. And the nonverbal message that is conveyed when we interrupt is that what they're saying is not important, or that we already know everything we need to know, all right, which is a faulty listening assumption because, if you only hear 2 minutes of somebody's experience, maybe there was going to be some information shared at the 4 or 5 minute mark that would have been really valuable for you, right? A lot of times people who do interruption may also feel like they want to respond. So they have decided that, they've heard enough and they, want to respond to what's being said, or maybe they don't want to hear any more about what's being said. So sometimes somebody might cut you off and they might try to change the subject, right? What does that make you feel like as a speaker? It does not make you feel validated when somebody interrupts you and changes the subject. It makes you feel as if they're avoiding, they don't want to talk about it. It's pretty invalidating on the receiving end, right? So I think that we can all be more conscious of our tendency to interrupt. It is not considered to be an effective professional or personal strategy, and it is something that I encourage all of you to look at. And when somebody is communicating with you, if they tend to interrupt you, then I encourage you to set a boundary, and you can respond in a neutral way by saying something like, "Excuse me, can I finish speaking?" Or you can say something like, "Excuse me, I'd like to finish what I was saying before you begin to speak." Okay. I have had to do this with my husband. I have also had to do this strategy when I'm working on professional committees sometimes at universities. And so this tends to be something that it's a good strategy to learn. Obviously, you don't want to use it every single time somebody interrupts you. And obviously, you want to be conscious of power differentials. So for example, I would probably let my boss interrupt me and not ask them to not interrupt me, right? Because there's a power differential. It is expected that the boss is in charge. They, presumably have more information and knowledge about the issue. But I think that in our close personal relationships, it's always good to ask people to give us what we want, because we can't assume that people are, first of all, that they know what we want. And we also do not want to assume that they are trying to be hurtful just because they interrupt us. Chances are they learned that behavior growing up by watching their parents communicate or by watching people communicate in the house. And so we can always become more conscious of these issues, and we can ask for what we need in a conversation. And we can also work to not interrupt other people so that we can give them what they need in a conversation as well. So let's look at the influence of media and technology on the process of listening and the way that we think about various issues. Obviously, we know that the mass media is ubiquitous. The media is everywhere, okay? We cannot go through our day without being inundated with messages or content or topics that the media is putting forth, right? It's interesting for us to think about that the research shows that if young children watch more than an hour of television each day, they are actually at risk for developing things like attention deficit disorder. Attention deficit disorder causes people to have a difficult time focusing on the task in front of them, and it can definitely lead to a lot of challenges in terms of school and professional development, and also in day-to-day communication with other people too, right? So this is something for us all to think about in terms of whether we have children or if we want children. We want to be conscious of the fact that although television does help a lot of people have children in terms of being like an instant babysitter, right? The TV that our children consume will influence their development and their thinking about the world. And this is always something we want to be conscious of. We might also think about our own perspective of the world and the amount of media that we consumed as children and the kinds of media or kinds of shows or films that our parents allowed us to consume. And we might think about how our childhood growing up in those kinds of media environments may have shaped the way that we developed, some of the challenges that we have faced, right? And things like that. In general, technology is influencing every aspect of our lives. We know that our technological listening landscape tends to evolve rapidly. So this is one of the reasons why we talk about removing distractions in our environment so that we can be present and mindful to effectively listen to the people that we are communicating with. On the other hand, technology allows us to connect with people maybe in other locations. Technology also allows us to maintain relationships that otherwise we might not maintain because we're able to communicate with people more effectively and efficiently. It expands our listening environment, which basically means that we are exposed to so many messages that we need to really be selective and have good boundaries with our media consumption and the media consumption that we allow for our children. And finally, it's worth discussing the fact that on a day-to-day basis, we are inundated with so many messages from the media, whether it's newspapers or whether it's the 5 o'clock news or whether it's your favorite TV shows or Netflix streaming or whether it's your Facebook updates, right? I think that something that Facebook has done is it allowed people to basically come into the home and the lives of other people that they know on a much more intimate personal level that prior to Facebook was not really an option, right? So some researchers have done studies that have looked at how much Facebook time people have and levels of satisfaction with their life and happiness with their life. And the research has shown actually that people who spend a lot of time on Facebook actually are less satisfied with their lives than people who tend to limit media and technology. So you can think about that from the idea of comparing ourselves to other people, right? Sometimes it may be a tendency for people to post pictures and different things on Facebook that make it look like they have this perfect little life, right? I don't know what your Facebook practices are. I personally have been off Facebook for the last 4 or 5 years. And I will say that my social networks are a lot smaller, but they're a lot tighter. I have good friends now that I talk to and see on a regular basis instead of having, hundreds of quote unquote friends that I haven't seen since I was in high school or something. So I think that, we really want to be conscious of the effect that Facebook can have on us. The idea of posting things and then like waiting for people to like it or waiting for people to comment a response on it, there's a type of attention-seeking behavior that's wrapped up in this whole Facebook process, right? I mean, you stay in touch with people, so that is a good thing because you can send people little messages and, oh, I haven't seen that friend for 20 years and we're going to reconnect. So that's one of the benefits. But I think that it's very important for us to be conscious of the possible negative effects that getting too wrapped up with technology can have, whether it's us comparing our lives to other people and maybe we think that our life is not as good because of the pictures that other people post. There's also the challenge that, we may feel like, well, we have all these friends on Facebook, but how many of these friends do you actually talk to on a regular basis? Or how many of these friends do you actually, get together with and share meaningful conversations with where you're supporting each other through this very challenging process of life, right? So I want to encourage you all to continue to seek out personal relationships and continue to develop closeness in the enduring relationships that you have. So enduring relationships are these relationships that we've had for much of our life, that we expect to have in the future, right? What we don't want to do is we don't want to sacrifice quality of a relationship with a person who's very close to us, like a family member or a close friend or a partner or our children, right? We don't want to sacrifice time and connection with the people who really matter to us because we have to spend 3 hours a day checking updates on Facebook, right? So let's cultivate the mindfulness and the awareness of the fact that technology can become a very intrusive factor in our lives, and that technology is a good thing in moderation, but that we want to learn how to be mindful of the effect of technology on us and our families, and we want to learn how to set good, healthy boundaries with technology so that we don't sacrifice close, effective, satisfying relationships for being able to watch those 5 hours of TV every day, or being able to check our Facebook thing 30 times a day, or whatever it is. For each of us, this might look differently, but I do really encourage us to take a look at this. And if you feel like it's a good idea to become more mindful or to set some boundaries, then I encourage you to do so. The final thing I want to say on this slide is that there have also been research studies done on undergraduate students exhibiting addictive relationships and behaviors with their cell phones. And so what they do in these studies is they take the students into a lab and they take away the student's cell phone, and they basically just monitor the way that the student is behaving. And what they're finding is that a lot of younger people especially tend to have a addictive relationship with their phone, that students who have their phones taken away from them for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours at a time actually start to exhibit the same kind of addictive withdrawal symptoms that people who are trying to stop smoking cigarettes exhibit. So they start to feel anxious, they're preoccupied with thinking, right? They might start to, feel like, they're having physical symptoms of anxiety, right? Your heart starts to race or your mind starts to race or whatever. So I want you also to be conscious of that. Like, how much power and influence are we giving our cell phones on a day-to-day basis, right? And do we want to have this kind of relationship with the media in our life, or do we want to set boundaries so that we can achieve a good work-life balance? I think this is something all of us need to be aware of, especially in the media-saturated environment in which we live. So to conclude this chapter, there are several things that we can do to practice effective listening skills. One of these things is that we can use our time wisely. So what this means is we want to plan our day so that at the end of the day or during the day, when it is time to listen to somebody, we have the time to put our computers away, turn the TV off, put our cell phones down, and actually be present and listen to someone effectively. We also want to work to give people our real attention. We want to make sure that when we are listening to people that we're being present and mindful, that we're listening truly to what they're saying in terms of the content and also the emotional component. We also want to really work to overcome any kind of personal biases that we might have that might impede our ability to listen effectively to another person. Withholding judgment is something that is very difficult to do all the time, but I believe that by becoming more conscious about some of the areas that we have judgments about, and by becoming more mindful in our communication interactions, we can learn to begin to notice the process of judging when it's happening in our communication, right? And this goes back to a previous lecture where we talked about this idea of developing the ability to be a good self-monitor. So if I am self-monitoring myself in my communications with a person, then I'm actually able to not only hear and observe how I am communicating verbally and non-verbally, but I can also learn to identify when I'm judging what someone is saying. And the process of learning to see or determine when you start to judge is extremely important, because when you see that you're judging someone, you can internally say something like, okay, let's stop the judgment. Let's let that judgment go, and let's go back to being present and being mindful in this conversation so that we can truly understand where someone's coming from. Another extremely important aspect of effective listening is maintaining emotional control. This is sometimes easier said than done. I know that we have all had experiences in our life where conversations with people were very upsetting to us. Some of us have responded more effectively than others. This is not about blame or about judging, but I do think that learning how to maintain emotional control is really important. One way to do that is to continue to be conscious of your breath in a conversation so that you are getting enough air through your system so that you can stay hydrated with air, right? You can feel present. You don't feel like you're holding your breath, which of course when we stop breathing, then that's when our body starts to feel anxious, right? And so we always want to make sure that we're breathing and trying to stay calm. The other thing I would strongly advise is that anytime you're in a conversation and it's apparent that anybody, you, the other person, somebody else, anyone in the conversation seems to be emotionally upset, all right? At that point, what you need to do is you need to take a break, okay? Learning how to take a timeout is one of the most effective communication strategies that we can use for our personal and professional relationships. This is a strategy that counselors are consistently giving their clients in terms of how to have good interactions with their family and people at work and things like that. So anytime someone is upset in the conversation, we responsibly want to stop the conversation for that moment by saying something like, okay, let's just stop this conversation at this moment and let's all go take 10 minutes or a few hours and let's go calm down so that we can approach this conversation again later on today or tomorrow so that we can really be using our best brains to really work on solving this together. One of the things that I have looked at in my previous education and in further education is the process of meditation. And what I learned when I became certified to be a meditation teacher was that one of the things that happens when we begin to get upset is that our brain starts to literally behave in a way where we are entering into the fight or flight zone, which is survival, right? And so the amygdala is basically that gland at the back of your neck that is responsible for the fight or flight process. And what that means is that if we're having a conversation and we're getting upset or somebody else is getting upset, as soon as your body and your mind enter into the fight or flight process, basically that's your body's ability to survive in the most dire of situations, like if you're being chased by a bear or having to swim away from a shark or something. So what that means is that the logical side of your brain, the logical part of your brain that is responsible for effective decision making, essentially is shutting down so that your body can work on just surviving, okay? This is one of the reasons that it is extremely important for us to pause conversations whenever there is someone who is upset so that we can go back into the situation when people have calmed down and find a logical solution. Another very important thing to do is to be willing to see another person's viewpoint. This is easier for some of us to do than others. However, I encourage you to work on always trying to step inside of another person's shoes before you jump to conclusions or judge what they're saying, and even before you respond to what another person has said. Finally, it's extremely important for us to listen to people with our whole body. We talked in a previous lecture about the importance of nonverbal communication. So when you are listening to people, you can give them your attention in terms of hearing them with your ears, but you can also attend to what's not being said. So these are things like the way that the person is standing, anything related to facial cues that could give you a sense of what they're feeling, right? Things that they might be doing in their body that can warn you of a negative potential response in the future. So for example, police officers are often taught how to decode people's nonverbal cues, because being able to determine when a person is about to launch their fist at you or fight with you is an extremely good skill so that you can stand a few feet back or remove yourself from the immediate vicinity of the person. So for example, if you see someone standing there and they're talking, or maybe they're not talking, but you see that their fists are clenched in balls, right? And you see that their nose is they're breathing quickly through their nose, right? And their pupils are extremely dilated. What that will tell you nonverbally is that that person is respirating, right? The nose, breathing in and out through the nose. And that is a marker that somebody is basically getting ready to attack you, right? So although this is an extreme example, the one with police officers learning how to see when possible criminals might be respirating, okay, so that they can make sure that they're not within attack range. Listening with our whole body is something that's extremely important. It will definitely affect our ability to be good communicators. And also we can learn to use our own nonverbal skills more effectively so that we convey the meaning that we want, both verbally and nonverbally. Thank you very much for your attention in this lecture. This has been a great reminder for me of the importance of good, effective listening skills. I hope that it was useful for you, and I cannot emphasize enough the importance of integrating much of the knowledge we talked about here into your basic listening practices. Thank you. I'll see you all in the next lecture.